right? The
My
second
second
book. What was the
and
title
I
of
have
that
a
first
third
one we
one.
did? Oh, you have a third coming. Good.
Well, you
What
see, it
the
was
first
one manuscript that became two
I
books. I
understand,
didn't finish the
understand.
second and
I
say, now
understand.
I'm going to do
Now
it.
that first one, though, was called
Madness, Heresy, and the Rumor of Angels.
You're right, I remember that.
The
That
subtitle, The Revolt Against the Mental Health System.
Yeah.
That was the one that, as you remember,
Right.
Tom wrote the foreword to.
Right. Thomas Szasz, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program a friend and an incredibly important scholar, if I may say so at the outset, and that's being Dr. Seth Farber, Seth Farber, PhD, and he's written a book that we want to show. Maybe we can show it right here at the outset, and it's called Eternal Day, The Christian Alternative to Secularism and Modern Psychology, and maybe we could come in tight focus on this and let people see the way to look in the book stands, because we would want to encourage one and all to be involved and in touch with this really what I think is a very important seminal book. And it's just out now, and so it's a pleasure, a great pleasure, personal and professionally, and in all other ways, to welcome to the program Dr. Seth Farber. And Seth, welcome very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Thank you.
Book is incredibly good, important book, it seems to me, but I wonder if you could, maybe you could share, we have a considerable amount of time, maybe you could share a little bit, if you would, your own background, and maybe you could weave that background, you know, where you were born, hail from, some academic background, and then also maybe you could weave that in with some of those personal things that were in your life that are relevant to the emerging of this particular book, because this book, you give a little biographical description at the beginning, because you've had an interesting and evolving life path. And but could you share a little of your own background?
Yeah, I guess the things that are probably most startling to people would be the transition I made from secular to a Christian humanist. I quickly qualify the term Christian because so often Christianity is associated today with very unhumanistic approaches. So transition from a secular Jewish to a Christian humanist perspective, and the transition from a PhD psychologist, someone who actually identified with the guild of professionals, to a supporter of the mental patients liberation movement. The term movement is too strong a term now because it's dwindled. But in 1987, after I finished my PhD, I met some of the people who had formed the Mental Patients Liberation Front in the early 1970s in New York, and other groups in other parts of the country. Whether that's a vital force today is a moot question. I would say it isn't, but perhaps it will be again.
It well might emerge. That might be a good dividing line that people could begin to build a sense of appropriate critique of world society.
So that's one of my heresies.
Yes.
I use heresy not to be Christian heresy, but the mental is that I came to agree with Thomas Szasz and R.D. Laing that in many cases people labeled mentally ill, psychotic, are wiser and more aware of what's going on, perhaps probably in most cases, than the psychiatrists are.
Right. Very often the case. They have the qualities of the shaman that have been very, venerated over the ages. But anyway.
Yeah, and of course that was one of Lang's point, the wisdom of the schizophrenic. Not to say that the person who's labeled schizophrenic is not in a tremendous state of confusion, not to, as our critics continually repeat the cliche, that we romanticize it or we overlook the fact of emotional suffering. That's not the case at all. The question is, how do we interpret that emotional suffering? And that gets to what has this book that I wrote. How do we interpret it? Is it mental illness? Now that term has been repeated over and over again ad nauseum, so that it has become reified in a sense that a particular interpretation of phenomenon is then seen as the phenomenon itself.
Yes,
it's like, just to use a kind of elementary distinction, a metaphor, there's an adage that the map is not the territory.
The Bateson, Gregory Bateson.
Was he the one that
I think so, I'm not mistaken. Right.
So there is no such thing as mental illness. Mental illness is a bad interpretation, a poor interpretation, an inadequate interpretation of the phenomenon of human suffering. We can agree what the territory is. What the territory is not is mental illness.
Okay, that's interesting.
Now, what I try to do in this book, and that this is a whole history of my conversion, I guess you would say conversion to Christianity, conversion to a Judeo-Christian worldview, which I think found its culmination in the New Testament. And I joined the Eastern Orthodox Church. Is that we now look at religion here in the modern secular New York as a kind of antiquated product of the past.
Oh, that is so de rigueur almost among intellectuals that it's all just myths and that sort of thing. And you know, there's a certain hubris that's just intrinsic to the intellectual class in a sense.
And what somehow gets circumvented in all that is what I call the Christian moment, and its pristine purity, as revealed in the New Testament and in some of the attempts to reconstruct Christ. Because what soon happened after the Christian revelation, God's revelation in Jesus Christ, and which I argue is a revelation both of the transcendence of God and of the sanctity of the human soul.
The immanence.
He's
immanent.
I speak of the immanence of God, in that God being present within the human soul, within humanity, humanity being within the world as a whole. There's a stage in the process of mystical illumination when the world is seen to exist within God. And of course St. Paul said, in God we live, move, and have our being. Now that revelation, that truth was obscured by the counter-revolution against Christianity, which took place in the name of Christianity. And the philosophical dimension of that revelation, counter-revolution, was to obscure what Christianity had revealed about man's calling to a higher station in life.
Maybe you could spell that out with the names of some of the people who would be familiar with and so forth, that were instrumental in that counter-reformation. And what were the points that were obfuscated by this counter-reformation or this development? Who were some people that were involved that we could identify with in terms of some kind of evolving ontology?
The first was, I want to qualify it before I even state it. The latter Augustine.
The latter Augustine.
So I'm not speaking of the Augustine who wrote the Confessions, which I haven't studied, but which, from the little bit I've read about the book, is in accord with my statement I made in the Christian Revelation that one finds God within the soul. In fact, there's a famous statement, Augustine, of that. But by the time he wrote The City of God, he'd become more cynical. And at that point, he developed the theory of predestination, of the diminution of the worth of the human soul as a result of Adam's sin.
The original sin notion, or no?
Or at least Augustine. There may be several interpretations, but the idea of original sin as interpreted by Augustine is that Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden. Well, that part's biblical. Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden. But the rest of the baggage that Augustine and his disciples, Luther and Calvin, this is frequently not known because it's believed that, Augustine is identified frequently with the Catholic Church, and Luther and Calvin with supposedly the great revolution against the Catholic Church. But a lot of that misanthropic, that anti-humanistic, pessimistic anthropology developed in the City of God by Augustine was appropriated and invigorated by Luther and Calvin. So all of these people felt that in order to praise God sufficiently, you had to denigrate humanity. So in the City of God, you have some of the most heinous doctrines about the things that are, for example, that do make God appear as some kind of cruel tyrant who takes pleasure in human suffering. For example, it's in City of God that Augustine says that humanity sinned with Adam in the Garden of Eden. Somehow we were contained in Adam in some kind of esoteric way that I've never been quite able to figure out. So we become guilty, according to Augustine, of Adam's sin. We're all guilty of the terrible sin that Adam and Eve committed in the Garden of Eden, and thus we all deserve to suffer in hell eternally.
We all deserve
We all deserve.
And is that the concept of original sin itself? Right?
Yes.
And it is then that the sacraments of certain sacerdotal organizations and representatives of something can intervene in order to stave that off, or what? I mean, what?
Well, that was actually the idea of the Catholic Church. That, and in some extent, it was Protestants retained the idea that baptism, the Catholic Church repudiated Augustine's idea of predestination. According to Augustine, there was a large group, the larger mass of humanity, were predestined by God to suffer in hell eternally. And the small group, a smaller group, was predestined for salvation.
That has tremendous problems in and of itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, a number of people at the time questioned what kind of God would arbitrarily, because remember, according to Augustine, it's arbitrary, since everybody deserves to burn in hell eternally.
Yeah.
We can even question the idea that everybody deserves to burn in hell eternally. I mean, even the worst human being, wouldn't 100 years or 1,000 years, even Hitler, wouldn't 1,000 years of burning in hell be sufficient? So at any rate, this is the God that he's depicted, the image of God depicted by Augustine and his disciples, because Luther and Calvin accepted this idea, and Luther was in fact an Augustinian monk before he left the church, and both pay their intellectual homage to genuflect before the great Augustine in the city of God. Why should some be saved and not others? And they attempted to answer that question, which is all deserve to burn in hell, but God would show his grace by saving some arbitrarily. So there's no real answer to that question. It's kind of finessed, but the doctrinal solution proposed by the trio, call them the trio or the triumvirate, Luther, Augustine, and Calvin, and they had millions of followers. This idea, captivated the popular imagination. And according to French scholar Jean de la Mode, it reached its height between the 13th and 18th century in Europe, and virtually everyone was tormented by this idea that they would not have the elect. Now that's the answer to the question. So the elect would be saved. Now, was it anything they did? Now, I don't want to get into metaphysical splitting hairs like Augustine and Luther Calvin did. So that Augustine claimed that on the one hand you had free will, but on the other hand you didn't have the freedom not to sin. So it gets into pretty strange kinds of doctrines that seem to be inherently contradictory. So what has happened is that there is, according to Augustine, the soul dies. According to Luther, to quote Calvin, and you read these people, and I was reading mostly their followers who wrote books on them, and you go and read all of them. Over and over again, like Calvin, there's more worth in all the vermin in the world than there is in a human being. Luther, there is nothing in us but sin. Calvin, well, there's a part of the remnant of the image of God, because that's biblical. And so doesn't want Calvin's cautious that remains. However, it's all in frightful deformity. No sooner does he admit that there's a part of the image, a remnant of the image that remains in man, that it's all frightful deformity. And Luther says it's not that my deeds are sinful. It's that my nature is sinful.
Yes, right.
It's not my entire person and nature has been corrupted by the fall. I was conceived and formed in the womb as a sinner.
And you have a thing in there, an ontology of deficiency or something like that?
Yes.
Go ahead.
In an attempt to characterize this worldview in which I claim in this book, we have still not embraced a genuinely Christian worldview, which is also a humanistic. Instead, we've been misled by these ghoulish caricatures of Christianity, by these pagan, heathen superstitions that parade before our eyes in Christian garb. And I characterize this as an ontology of deficiency. That somehow, to put it in, somehow being is lacking. Heidegger talked about the age of forgetfulness of being. So in the case of these ontologies of deficiencies, and by the way, I subsume both secular and so-called religious worldviews, such as theological worldviews, such as Augustine's, and Freudianism.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Under that ontology.
Yeah, I know. You make this incredible connection between that and Freudianism and then the modern secular and the mental health helpers and so forth. Now, I wonder if we take 1 second, right? Because you went over it quickly.
I didn't answer.
Oh, go ahead, follow it.
So that being is lacking, and
Yeah.
let me just put it in theological terms.
Sure.
That the love of God is not sufficient to embrace all of humanity. In the Bible, it's said in the New Testament that God desires the salvation of all men. But in Luther and Calvin and Augustine and in much of Protestantism, the majority are predestined to suffer eternally in hell.
You God, yeah.
And this is an ontology. Now, as opposed to that, that's a theology of deficiency, that God, or an ontology. An ontology of plenitude is the idea of the infinite grace of God, or as to put it in philosophical terms, that there's a plenitude in the depths of the ontological heart of the universe, a sufficiency.
In its nature, in the nature of the universe itself. It doesn't have to do with transformations within the evolution of events and so forth. I wonder if I could, because you went over quickly, you were raised originally, and if I could, the Old Testament, Judaic. Well, you made a big jump when you went from Judaism
actually,
to that.
I was raised
and some people see some of the prescriptions, some of the dimensions of the Old Testament in pretty harsh terms as well. You know, it was a big change for you. And how did you get from Judaism to Christianity? I don't want to take you off track, but it's sort of a large jump right there, isn't it?
That is a good point. Except I was raised more.
And the harshness of the Old Testament that some people see.
Yeah, I was raised as a Jewish atheist, so I never read the. I never even.
Oh, I see. You were.
You know, when I was growing up, I never read the New Testament. My parents gave me the option of going to Sunday school, but what child is going to exercise that option? If he was bad enough, I had to go to school.
Yes, right. So, right.
But I would say that criticism of the Old Testament, from my reading, seems to be warranted. Although I would agree with St. Paul and I'm in the Eastern Orthodox Church.
I know we want to talk about that.
That the person who accepts Christ becomes an honorary Jew. When St. Paul began his mission, said by accepting the message of Jesus Christ, by joining the body of Christ, becoming part of the body of Christ, which is the church, which in St. Paul's time had not yet become corrupted, the church. So we had a clear counterculture, to use a modern term, a culture in which free people and the slave both had the same status, in which Jew and, at least in the first century, in which Jew and Christian, Jew and Gentile were friends and brothers rather than enemies. But I think it's a warranted criticism that God reveals himself progressively. Now, I'm not a theological scholar, but I think the most intelligent answer I've heard to that is the revelation of God being a progressive one, and that it's adapted to the human understanding, so that the God in the Old Testament appears frequently as a capricious God, or a God who gives vent to his anger. Whereas the God, and this is probably what drew me into the orbit of Christianity, seeing it not as a repudiation of Judaism, but the flower of Judaism, because there's a discontinuity in the sense that you can find some of those images of God as a loving God, a God who forgives in the Old Testament, but it flowers in the New Testament, in which Jesus shows us who God is, the being God in Christ, the human being who forgives his enemy, who turns his other cheek, who consistently practices love, and who seeks not to elevate himself to a higher caste, but to be of service to all humanity. So this idea of a virtuous being is thus the idea of the divine, who places, and thus is a model of humanity, of what we're really meant to become. Christ is the first fruits of what we're to become. And only then will we create a civilization not based upon cannibalism. I talk about existential cannibalism, this caste system that's been, that we find that we found in Christianity in its perverted form, that Christ polemicized against, and that is recapitulated, this caste system, in the idea of the elect. And we find that again in Freudianism. So
Yeah.
I made a transition, not so much from a religious Jew, but from a secular, in fact, in my...
Atheistic Jew, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my messianic
yeah,
fervor
yeah.
expressed itself in Marxism
Yes, right.
in my college days.
Yes,
I'm not a Marxist anymore,
no,
but that was
yeah.
in the neo-Marxist, I guess I
Went
called
through
it that.
existentialism and that sort of thing and everything.
Well, existentialism I found too gloomy, but
All
I
right,
did
all right.
believe that we could realize the kingdom of heaven on earth, and I do believe that now, and I think that's been another of that's the heart of the Christian message, the kingdom of God on earth, which was preached and taken seriously by secular groups, you know, and in practice was, you know, perverted, obviously. The Russian Revolution, we could talk about all the revolutions that heralded and trumpeted noble ideals, but they became heirs to that eschatological vision of Christianity that Christians gave up and spiritualized. And I'm trying to bring this back to the center of, this is one of the center of Christianity. I have 6 in the book. I talk about 6 features of Augustinianism.
All right.
I call it Augustinianism.
Yeah, you really concentrate on, yeah, and this is the latter Augustine you're talking about. So you make a distinction between the younger and the latter, or something of that sort of thing?
This is
in
the
your
latter, and this is,
yeah.
this
and
is
this
in
makes
the
a
city
big,
of God. And
so it might be confusing to some people who think in terms of the other.
Yeah, it is confusing, and I don't mean to offend people who
not at
spent
all.
their lives studying Augustine and are scholars on Augustine, blah, blah, blah. The point was, by the time Augustine wrote The City of God, Constantine had given his blessing to the Christian sect.
Yes.
And it became the religion of the Roman Empire, rather than a persecuted sect who was, you know, tortured and thrown to the beasts,
Tigers,
in the arena,
Yeah.
because they refused to worship the Roman Empire, because they had only one God.
But you see this great importance of Augustine, and you deal with it in the book. And
Yeah.
and then you see a continuity between that and the Calvin and that sort of thing, and then on into Freud, the modern mental health helping services, as it were,
the French scholar,
that you want to take great exception
what the French
to,
scholar Delisle called Augustinianism, as I do, really got a lot of it, became most vigorous as a result of the work of Luther and Calvin, and it kind of it became a worldview that captivated the collective imagination of humanity for centuries.
All right, all right.
Blake speaks in that poem Jerusalem of mind-forged manacles, and the marks of weakness and of woe that he sees on every passerby he goes through in the London streets.
Yeah, right.
And then of the chimney sweeper and
London town is burning. Yeah,
the dichotomy between the blood of the chimney sweeper and the magnificence of the castle. So this is something that we still have today. So these are the 6 hallmarks of the Augustinian, and I can go through them.
Well, or if you want to quickly, we do want to move it up. We want to move it up to Freud. We want to move up to Freud and post-Freud
you
and
will
the
find
mental
these things
health.
in Augustinian and Freudianism and Luther and Calvin, these 6 common points.
All right, run them all.
1, there's diminution of the worth of the human soul. The human soul is no longer worthy. In Freudianism, it's expressed in pseudoscientific terms, because in the modern age we've come away from religious superstitions.
Oh, yeah, it's all just superstition.
So we wrap our religious superstitions in a scientific veneer.
Yeah,
Okay,
science.
so we say, instead of saying that the soul is damaged by original sin, we say that the person is mentally ill.
All right.
Okay, that's the first thing. There's a diminution of the worth of the soul, ontological deficiency.
Okay.
Second, there is a result of an event that happened. He has a narrative dimension to it. Something happened. In Augustine and Luther and Calvin, it's Adam did a terrible deed, an awful, perverse.
The fall.
The fall.
Yeah, right.
But it's a voluntary deed.
All right.
It's not just an innocent fall.
Yeah, all right.
It's a dastardly deed for which humanity will suffer forevermore, and it can't be reversed.
Yeah. Wow.
So there's that irreversible nature of the fall. So it's
parole.
that event that happened. In Freud, it switches from the fall in ancient past to the misdeeds of the parents.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, right.
The Oedipal complex.
Yeah.
Now, actually, in classical Freudianism, the parents aren't blamed as much as in modern psychoanalytic thought. So let me just concentrate on modern Freudian thought.
Go away.
Because if we go into all that, it'll take us too far.
Yeah, I know. You've got a sense of the time. Yeah.
That's what I was taught. I was a true believer in the Freudian faith.
You were really, yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay.
I believe that that as a result of modern psychoanalytic thought, as a result of mistakes committed by parents in the early years, the first several years of a child's life, the person was warped in a sense.
Yes, right, by those
And in fact, during my period in graduate school, not only did I believe this of other people, but I believed that there was something wrong with me.
Yes, right. Okay.
That's how it's experienced phenomenologically.
Yes,
There's something wrong with me.
Okay.
That somehow I had been warped.
Well, that's intrinsic to the whole idea of the mental health helping thing. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong. You wouldn't be here. You know, I mean, and we're going to make it right.
Yeah, I want to point out that that is not. Here's a case of the difference between the map and the territory.
Yeah.
Because someone's suffering doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them.
Right.
And I try to say in this book and in other books that the person is in a process of growth. I mean, if a woman's pregnant with a baby, we don't say there's something wrong with her. We say she's giving birth.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so that's the second feature. The third is there's a caste system now. Okay. There's the elect and there's those who are predestined.
Yes.
Now, in graduate school, I believed that there was hope for me because I was among the neurotics.
Yes, right.
And all I had to do was to go to a psychoanalyst for years.
Being only neurotic.
Yeah. And I would take the psychoanalytic sacraments. I would receive the psychoanalytic sacraments.
Yes.
I would lie down on the couch. In the modern day, you don't lie down so much, except the real classical, stuffy ones.
Yes, right.
But you sit there and you talk about your past over and over and over again.
Endless.
And and you genuflect before Freud. Freud is the Moses. Freudianism has become, speaking of transition, you asked, I didn't make the transition from a religious Jew to to Eastern Orthodox Church. I made a transition from, well, as I grew up, but by the time I had a worldview in college, it was Marxism. Right, then I made the transition. I became a believer in the Freudian religion.
Oh, all right, okay.
The religion of Thomas Szasz called it the religion of the Jewish people.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Right,
I mean, because nowadays, how many religious Jews do you meet?
Lang go along with that?
It was Freud's formulation.
All right.
I mean, it was Szasz's Freud.
Yeah,
Szasz was Jewish himself.
The myth of mental illness.
But in fact, I think Szasz, we could even say it's the religion of the intelligentsia.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So I believed in that religion. So and then I made the transition from that to Hinduism, in which I gave up. That's the first 2 points.
Yeah, I got
first 3 points.
Yeah.
I gave up the idea of that the soul was diminished. I accepted that the soul was holy and would remain holy and could not be destroyed. The nobility of the human soul, the divinity of the soul, could be obscured.
Yes.
And we could fail to realize it and thus fail to actualize
This you got out of your acquaintanceship with a Hindu?
I think that was I've discovered that first in the writings of Sri Aurobindo.
Sri Aurobindo,
who lived from 1880 or something to 1950.
Pondicherry, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Were you there?
I know, I never
No,
went
okay,
to India.
all right.
I read a couple thousand pages of Aurobindo's works.
Right. He was
very influenced by his interpretation of the Hindu scriptures, the Vedas.
I understand,
And then I found the same thing in Eastern Christianity, the same vision that the soul was not destroyed by original sin, that the image of God remained intact in the soul, was obscured but not destroyed by original sin. Second point, something happened. That we agree upon, the fall. Third point, is there predestination? No. But let me say how to continue how it takes place in modern Freudian psychoanalytic and biological psychiatry today. There's the elect, there's the lucky ones who can be saved by psychoanalysis or in the Freudian paradigm, or in the modern psychological, or by medication, as they call it.
Right,
There's the unfortunate ones, the schizophrenics, the borderlines, who are doomed. In that theory, and that
they used to be treated with lobotomies and things in the old days.
And they are still. I was taught in graduate school. That was the one area in which I was always a little bit of a unorthodox, not in the religious. I was heterodox and nonconformist. And even in my true believer Freudian days, I thought that psychosis was a curable disorder. Now I don't believe it's a disorder at all.
Right.
I believe, and I think Christians who are worshipers, or ought to be, of the crucified and risen Christ, ought to be the first to recognize that a nervous breakdown can be an opportunity for a spiritual resurrection.
Right. It's interesting.
The death of the old man can be an opportunity for the rebirth, and
Yeah.
that's why I want Christians to realize that we ought not to be abandoning people who are in spiritual crises, and this is the majority of people.
This is what they're doing now. They say go see one of the professional helpers.
Psychiatrist.
See a psychiatrist.
And
then they abandon
people,
that role that they could be of a spiritual one who could help them
they
find
lose
their
the
way.
opportunity to be reborn in Christ.
That's happening a lot now.
Well, I don't know of any exception to it.
Yeah, why that is, I don't know. But anyway, I don't want to get you off the track. But yeah, it is. Yeah, okay. That's one of the themes we want to come back toward the end for sure.
The church completely has capitulated to the psychiatric establishment.
Yeah, right. Because they're the scientists with the degrees,
they're
the experts.
Yeah, they're the experts.
Yeah.
If you're schizophrenic, you can't be dealt with by a normal human being.
Yeah.
You need to have someone who's expert. And in fact, all the research shows that that experts don't do any better at therapy than a layperson.
That's right.
And as far as psychotics go, people who are they do worse because this is what happened to a person who has a breakdown. And I tell the story in my first book, because I told the story of 7 people. I picked 7. I could tell you the story of 400 or 500 people who were hearing voices, went crazy, and are now perfectly normal individuals.
Yeah.
In fact, they're super normal individuals.
Super normal.
They're better than normal.
Better than normal.
Better than normal. In a Nietzschean
Yeah,
sense.
I know. Right.
They're more aware of what's happening on the planet.
Right.
They're more spiritually oriented than your average person. They take
absolutely.
the idea of God.
It's very often the case. People who come through that veil of tears or whatever that is are just got some sort of a consciousness that is really creative.
Now, of course, I don't deny that there are people who are crazy and go out and kill other people.
Yeah, like Manson or something.
But those people are used by the psychiatric establishment as a way of advertising their power.
Yeah, that's the advertising.
If you don't buy, there are all these Charles Mansons out there.
Yeah, right.
And we need to save you from them. And what they do is they take these people who are vulnerable, sensible people, the majority of whom, some of whom can be annoying, they're having, and they indoctrinate them to believe that they're chronically mentally ill.
Yeah, and the society, they indoctrinate the society to
And
that.
society
and it lays the basis
believes that.
And it lays the basis for, we'll get to it, lays the basis for the helping professions that
And
are
the church
emerging
has
in such
completely
dimension.
accepted this.
Yeah, the church has capitulated, in your view.
For a long time.
All the church, right? The whole of the church, all of the church.
I haven't come, I have yet to find, my friend Frank Schaeffer says that monasteries used to be places where people who were crazy or having spiritual crisis could go. There may be a few exceptions in various parts of the world, but someone who's having a spiritual crisis is not likely to find refuge at any monastery.
Really?
Because they're, particularly I know in the...
Get thee to an asylum, huh?
Get thee to an asylum.
Yeah.
They'll be told, well, we can't handle this. Anyone who, for example, not too many people go to monasteries seeking help, but what does frequently happen is they'll go to their priest or minister.
Yeah.
If they say...
They'll get referred to the shrink on the corner.
Psychiatrist or a psychologist, or if they say they're hearing voices, they'll tell them to go to the local mental hospital, where they'll be shot up with psychiatric drugs that cause...
Which are increasingly powerful.
increasingly destructive. These drugs make...
Powerfully destructive, all right.
I won't go into all the side effects of these drugs.
No.
But I do want to
I
say
know you
that
can,
the so-called antipsychotics, I do say, I do go to some of that in this book and in the other books.
Yeah.
Peter Bregan, I recommend his books. He goes into that. Dr. Bregan is a psychiatrist in toxic psychiatry.
Yes.
You can read about the side effects. But one of them is between 30 to 50% of people who take them will develop tardive dyskinesia.
I don't know what that is.
A usually irreversible neurological disorder character. It's like its effect looks like that of Parkinson's disease.
Really? Yeah.
You develop you develop a shuffle. Actually, tardive dyskinesia refers to the involuntary muscular spasms.
Okay, right,
The whole body, the arms,
directly
particularly the arms and the legs.
Yeah, directly attributed to the side effects of these antipsychotic
Even the
drugs.
psychiatric establishment can't deny that.
Well, that's all right. Now, okay, I don't want to bring you back. You were going through 6 things.
Okay, so
the problem is we don't have much time. But go ahead.
Okay, the fourth thing is, okay, the fourth is, and this is the spiritual fundamental essence of my book and of my argument. There is an estrangement in the Augustinian tradition between God and man. The abyss can never be closed. See, there was paradise, and paradise was lost.
Yeah.
And a few, an elect, will be saved, but the majority are destined to suffer eternally in hell. The same thing in Freudianism. There was paradise in the beginning. The baby was brought into the world in a state of, Freud described it as mystical bliss. In fact, Freud believed that all mysticism was just a recapitulation of the memory, a recovery of the memory of the state of bliss that the infant experienced in its mother's womb when it was in union with the mother. So interesting that in Freudianism, too, we have this idea of the Garden of Eden, but it's individualized and it's secularized to refer to the child's union with the mother. Nevertheless, in Freudianism and in Augustinianism, unlike true Christianity, paradise is lost for the majority of people and can never be recovered again. It can only be recovered by an elite. This is an elite of super-educated intellectuals, for the most part, educated people. Freud said it had to have a high degree of education, and of course you had to be a true believer in the Freudian faith.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the fourth. But in Freud, I want to point out this abyss between God and man that can't be bridged. Freudianism, it becomes an abyss between nature and man.
That's interesting.
So that almost everybody suffers from some kind or other of mental illness. Now, what is illness? It means you're outside the order of nature.
Yes, right.
Instead of outside the order of God, as in Augustinianism and Lutheranism and Calvinism, you're outside the order of nature. And only a few can be restored. But unlike in Christianity, even for the elect, it can't be completely restored. There's still scars.
I don't want to touch, get in your way and everything.
I've got two more points.
All right, go ahead and make the points.
Well, but if you want
No, I was just going to say, you keep referring to Calvin and that you Protestant. What about the Western Catholic Church? I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't bring that in. I mean, where does it fit in terms of that? Because I know you have become an ascriber to the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Church, the Western Church. I don't know, because Calvin and that is the Protestant.
I have been kind of
and I don't want to get in the way of
my
your narrative.
artillery at the more reactionary, what I would call reactionary segments of Protestantism, because Catholicism, for all its crimes and inquisitions, and Christianity has a very
Western Christianity you're talking about
Western
now.
Christianity and Eastern too has a very checkered.
It's got to.
Checkered history. Western is worse.
Because you're now an Eastern Christian.
Okay, because the Eastern Christians never accept, and most Catholics won't accept these Augustinian ideas today either. I don't want to go into the whole history of that, but most people, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, accept the reality of mental illness.
Yeah, right,
And my argument is there is no such thing as mental illness. This is the idea of original sin, that the soul has been damaged, dressed up in modern secular scientific garb, and neatly packaged and sold to the American people.
And it is
the American people has gotten a bill of goods. They sold out their birthright, and people all over the Western world where they worship the psychiatric priesthood.
Yeah, and it's a huge business.
It's a huge,
business.
22,
business.
the APA,
business.
It's a business, it's an industry.
Okay, now go to 5. What's 5?
4 and 5 are what's happened to Christianity is it's become this narrow idea of spiritualization of the idea of the kingdom of God on earth. So most Christians no longer believe that we can have the kingdom of heaven on earth. They no longer believe. So that's been the tragic wound inflicted on Christianity. Something that happens after you die.
There's not immanence of God in the moment.
There will not be God's kingdom on earth. By the way, this is why I stress the continuity of Christianity with Judaism, because Jesus in the Christian reading of the Old and the New Testament was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. In Jesus' work and ministry, the kingdom of heaven on earth became operative. Thus he had the power to heal lepers and to restore the sight to the blind. But the kingdom of God did not happen with Jesus. To the question that the Jew will ask the Christian, well, if Jesus was the Messiah, how come there's no kingdom of heaven on earth?
Yeah, and you call this kingdom of heaven.
And that, I say, is
Did you notice Hitler and things? Yeah.
This is the kingdom of hell. This is the kingdom of Satan that we live in now. And the reason for the delay of the parousia, the return of Christ for 2,000 years, it's been is one reason, I would say, at the risk of being accused of being a heretic. It's not because of God, it's because of humanity. It's because we've accepted this version of predestination. We've accepted this caste system that relegates other human beings to hell.
You used to be a Marxist. You don't see a connection between it because you can see, the caste system or the class system that the Marxists see, or the idea of an elite economically in a materialistic sense. There are a lot of people who see a world that way. A lot of people see a world emerging that way. A lot of people are concerned with economics, and they're concerned with, the idea of an emerging non-scarcity reality, and it has ontological implications and so forth. You don't ever tie those things in and so forth. There's a natural tendency for some people to tie that into a materialistically based, unjust kind of world that is perpetuated at the interest of some people and at the suffering of others, and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, if I do, in fact, I say, if I understand you correctly,
Yeah.
I say that this terrible bastardization of Christianity, this terrible transformation of Christianity into something the complete opposite of what Jesus preached, love of
Following
the
Augustine.
nobility of man, the priesthood of all believers,
Okay.
resulted in part because there was an economic motive
Okay.
and a status motive
Uh-huh.
for the elite within a certain elite within the Christian world to separate themselves out from the hoi polloi, from the masses.
Yeah, right.
Freud also had this tremendous
Okay.
contempt for humanity,
Okay.
and to become the priestly class.
Yes, right. The sacerdotal class. Yeah, right.
And this is what happened under Constantine. The persecuted sect, the people who said Christ is to be found in the beggar, all of a sudden said Christ is to be found in the king.
Okay. Yeah.
Christ is to be found in
Right.
Constantine. And they began to live in palaces.
Okay, I understand, right. I didn't mean to get you off. Now, what about, you coming down to the
sixth thing was,
yeah.
the fifth thing is that focus on individual, the kind of salvation as opposed to, and this kind of preoccupation with, there's something wrong with me. How do I get saved?
Yes, right. Yeah, that's
I'm
a pretty
mentally
small
ill.
raft I want to get on, if
Yeah.
I can, so that's got, it's a marketer's dream world, isn't it? Yeah, well, go ahead.
So that the individualistic idea of salvation, which is, there's no need for the individual to be saved. There's nothing wrong with the individual.
That's
There's
your
something,
assumption, yeah, okay.
And I believe that's Christian world.
Okay, go on.
There's something
Sixth.
wrong with a world in which groups of people make their living by destroying others. Six is the eclipse of that original Christian vision, Jewish Christian vision of the kingdom of heaven on earth. I spoke of the fourth thing, the abyss that in Augustinianism, Calvinism, whatever, that separates God from man since the fall, and the abyss in Freudianism that separates nature from man, so that man becomes sick man, pathological man, deranged man. I remember, just to give an anecdote, I went for an interview with someone who was interviewing me for a job. This was 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, when I was still believed in the mental illness garbage and the psych to some extent. Well, I was becoming skeptical of it, and I said, I think it was a drug program or something, and I said, well, after the first year, do you cure them? He said, oh, no, we can't cure them. The illness is too deeply entrenched.
Yes, right, okay.
The most we could do is get them functioning.
Yes, right.
Keep
them functioning.
Keep them functioning at a rather low level.
Yes, right.
So, so that becomes the focus. So the thing is then, what becomes obscured is that we really can bridge the abyss between humanity and God. What came about as a result of the fall is not the destruction or the diminution of individuals' worth. We're not mentally ill. But what did come about was our forgetfulness, our loss of awareness of our function as stewards, as priests of the earth, as ambassadors of God in the natural kingdom, as hybrids who are at one, both spiritual, natural beings, and that our purpose and function as priest is to consecrate the world, to see its intrinsic holiness, and to live in the world in such a way that everything we do is an act of communion with the living God.
All right, yeah.
And so that everything we do becomes a kind of prayer, an act in which we participate as human beings, as the priests of God, in making the world holy. And this is what happened to the people who are labeled mentally ill. I think that some of them have an inkling that something has been lost in the modern world. They can preach, these psychologists can come and preach all they want about self-esteem. You've got to imbue people with self-esteem. But if we're just natural biological creatures who are just here as a result of a freak of nature, as a result of random
Chance
mutation,
and necessity, monad.
then there's no glory, there's no nobility. But we are the link between the finite and the infinite. We are the priests of God, and the God, the infinite source of good and of love, who created us out of his own being, desires for us to halo the creation.
There's a tremendous amount of things.
And by doing that, we will be we will be coming again into communion with God, and we will be recovering the state of bliss that existed in the Garden of Eden, but recovering it at a higher level.
Yeah, we might be at the Garden of Eden, except we will be knowledgeable of things that we were not perhaps knowledgeable of. We've gained a great deal, and that, in a sense, is fulfilling the evolutionary purpose of God's a priori mysterious design in the universe. That has tremendous psychotherapeutic kind of implications, that kind of spiritual message, or spiritual context within which a person can operate. The church, or that spiritual message, is fulfilling the role, or could fulfill much better, the role that the helping services, or the psychologists and so forth, are called upon to do. Now, is one of the themes you're particularly concerned with?
Yeah, in fact, the helping services can't do it. I mean,
cannot?
They cannot. Ultimately, they cannot.
But it's because a big lobby.
Because we ultimately got to put them out of business. They could do
That's a big statement.
They could do some good in the meantime by acting as transition, but they're not. They're doing more harm.
You think they're doing more harm than good? All these people are trying to help their fellow suffering human beings.
Well, you got to look at what's happening in mental hospitals, not just what happens between Woody Allen and his psychoanalyst.
Every day for 16 years. Yeah.
But I mean, I pick out that as just another extreme, but you don't look at just what happens on Park Avenue, blah, blah, blah. You got to go and see the horrific things that are happening to people in the public mental health system, as I've seen.
Really, yeah.
That you're really seeing, you're looking into the most hellish kind of thing imaginable since the concentration camps.
Okay, but okay, I hear that.
So
now that's a horror story,
do.
but you're looking at it generically in a certain sense. The helping services on whole, and in substances, I mean, the sum of that, I mean, you've got an awful lot of very good souls who are trying to help fellow suffering human beings in the name of the mental health system, and you, in a certain sense, would say that they may be going in the wrong direction or something, or that the church might be able to fulfill
the body
that role
of
better.
God.
Okay.
I mean, that's what it's meant to be. No, actually, I took a wager when I joined the church.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's a wager of faith.
Yeah.
And the wager is that the church would fulfill the purpose for which it was instituted by Jesus.
This is a big personal statement on your step, because you've taken the step of joining, maybe it's fair to, this is an autobiographical, in a certain sense, you've joined the Eastern Orthodox Church. Maybe you can spell out why the Eastern Orthodox.
Well, I'm appealing to all Christians.
Yes.
I'm in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I appeal to my fellow Orthodox, and I also appeal to all Christians.
You couldn't find a niche.
I don't know the plan of salvation. I believe that there is a plan of salvation, but I don't have the blueprint in front of me.
Right. Okay.
I have some of the. I know which turns in the road, certain turns in the road that need to be taken.
But what was
one is the church needs to. The Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestant Church needs to take a stand against the mental health system. The mental health system, even at its best, is a caste system. They're professionals and their clients. The church is the body of Christ. There is no caste system. It transcends caste.
Well, in some of those churches, you have a priestly class. You know, the Catholic Church has a pope and cardinals and a whole hierarchical system, and so do all the others. And so
in the
don't
Eastern Orthodox Church, you have priests. I don't want to get into theological discussions, but the Eastern Orthodoxy affirms that every human being is a priest of God.
Oh, okay.
And I'm sure there are many Protestants.
Is this a distinctive thing of the Orthodox Church?
Well, it's in the Bible.
Is this one?
We're all called
is it
to be
distinctive
priests.
in your mind that you have been called there? You couldn't find a niche within the Christianity of the Western tradition. You found it in the Eastern. And what is that thing that you found?
I mean, perhaps I could have, but
no, but you didn't. You didn't. That's what I'm saying. You didn't. You found it in the Eastern. What is it that drew you to that, or how did you come to be at that point?
The theology,
or was it an accident of who you ran into?
Eastern Orthodox theologians.
What's the difference? What differentiates
those 6 different things that I said were characteristic of Augustinianism were rejected by Eastern Orthodox theologians.
Okay.
They acknowledge that there has been a fall. Not all the lay people know this, but if you read the great theologians and the philosophers, philosophers are not, I won't go into the distinction between philosophers and theologians. Read Vladimir Lusky, read Shemenman, read Vladimir Soloviev of the 20th century. But you find they acknowledge that a fall has taken place. I mean, all you have to do is look around us. This is not, go out in the streets in New York, or this is not what God intended. Something went wrong.
Oh, right.
I'm not denying that.
Or maybe on the course toward getting right.
Well, that's another part of my book.
Right.
I mean, and I do accept a Christian growth model in that there has been the loss of the unity that existed with God, but it's this period of estrangement. The prodigal son wanders away from home, but this period of wandering perhaps is necessary for our own growth, and that's what the Eastern Orthodox fathers, many of them said
Okay.
that.
Yeah, you understand, I'm not that familiar with
For
Eastern
instance,
Orthodox.
as opposed to St. Augustine, let's take Gregory of Nyssa.
All right.
Lived at the same time.
Right.
Fall had terrible consequences. Death
Yeah.
was not intended by God, physical mortality. However, the image of God was obscured, but not destroyed by the fall. So the intrinsic worth of human beings remains. There's no mental illness.
I see.
There's no
that concept
there's no
is not there in
idea
their ontology.
that we've been damaged.
Yeah.
That's not there in the ontology. No, I mean.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting in a place like Russia now, right?
And
Russia,
also, there's no guilt,
Russia.
for example. There's no guilt, for example. Augustine and Luther and Calvin. I didn't emphasize this as much because you don't find it as much in Freudianism.
Yeah.
You know, I started by mentioning it, felt that we were guilty and therefore all of us deserve to suffer in hell.
Yeah.
In the Eastern Orthodoxy, we're not believed to bear any guilt.
Yeah.
In Catholics, by the way,
Interesting, yeah.
there's the guilt, but it's washed away by baptism.
Yes, right, all right.
Anyway, so...
Yeah, you got the, it would be an interesting thing in Russia
And
where...
in the Eastern Orthodoxy, just to come back, there's not an abyss that can't be bridged between God and man. It's accepted that God wills the salvation of all human beings. They don't use any of the sophistic kinds of arguments that that Augustine used against Pelagius and later Augustinians used. There's the rejection of the idea of predetermination and the contention that God wills the salvation of all and that humanity participates with God in the process of salvation. So this is absolutely essential. We're not just sit here passively. If we sit here passively, we're all going to hell.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you think this is going to create this ontology. Is this an ontology of sufficiency? I mean, I've heard you use that term, or is there more of an ontology that is appropriate in terms of encouraging the fulfilling of the best of the human spirit, as it were, within the Eastern Christian tradition, and that more people might be attuned to that? And another thing I'm interested in, we've got a great big problem in the form of what was the Soviet Union, which was overlaid with Marxism, secular, godless Marxism for so long, that kind of thing. And now the country is in terrible shape and so forth. The Eastern Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox, do you think that there's going to be, can you just address that maybe briefly, that the growth of, or the rebirth, as it were, of Orthodox Christianity in the Soviet, what was the Soviet Union or in that part of the world, the implications of that? I don't know, maybe it's a skew from what we do, or could there be a growth could there be a model for Eastern Orthodoxy that could have relevancy to the West and to other parts of the world?
I'm not an authority. Let me just quickly speculate on that, which is this, that Russia has to recover her national identity again. And part of recovering that national identity is recovering her messianic function as a leader of humanity. And there you will find that some of the great minds of the modern era, Dostoevsky, Vladimir Solovyev, Nikolai Berdyaev, who were all, Tolstoy left the church, but he was certainly a great contributor to the Russian Christianity. But he was estranged from the church, unlike the others that I've mentioned. So, but for Russia to constitute herself as a nation, I think that's necessary for every country, just as it's necessary for us as individuals to recover some sense of identity of who we are as children of God, not as mentally ill or as people in need of. So it's necessary as a nation for each.
Yeah. So that might be a model that we'd be able to look for models, mentors, these kind of things in a world that's changing so quickly now. And that might be one, if there's going to be some sort of a, a spiritual rebirth or a spiritual reawakening or a realization of the potentiality of that away from the overriding and hubris of so much of secular humanism. And that there is a spiritual component to this, and that you think is important as far as the salvation of the world is concerned, or humanity?
Well, I don't think man can live without God, and I discovered in my own life, in a time, many times discovered over and over again, that one proves the existence of God not so much by intellectual arguments as by worshiping. And that in that act of worship, there is something is grasped, something is seen. One becomes certain that there is a reality infinite outside oneself that wills our salvation. And the idea that one can live with that kind of hubristic stance, that through technology we will conquer, or that, for example, when I speak of the
technology is part of
ontology of deficiency, might also refer to the ontology of absence, that the deconstructionists, here are people who have rejected God and who say that there's an absolute nothingness at the heart of the universe.
Right, or it's all chance and necessity.
And that there's nothing kind of authoritative. What we find an authentic stance, at least one authentic stance of humanity, is that of Goethe said the greatest wisdom is to fathom what can be fathomed and to bow in reverence before the unfathomable. And in that bowing in reverence before the unfathomable, we recognize and affirm life as a gift. And that affirmation is necessary. As I say, just as our existence may be appreciated, but it doesn't come to fulfillment with that act, in the same way that if a man and a woman are in love and the man doesn't say to the woman and vice versa, I love you, and goes through the whole relationship, there's something missing.
Yeah, there would be.
There's an act of ritual that's absolutely essential for humanity to function and to function in the way in which we were meant to function. That was recognized by Mircea Eliade, who said, now that we've dispensed with rituals, we find them in a kind of profane activities. We recreate them. So secular, strange rituals, secular rituals become substitutes for that sense of the sacred that's missing in our lives.
Yeah, that sacred, the sacred. Yeah, and Blake one time said the way towards wisdom is through excess, which is a kind of interesting thing. But there's also, or you could take somebody, because the technology is part of God's pattern. It's part of the evolution of events, because it's here. It's part of the evolution, and it could be that there is a Fuller, Buckminster Fuller saw, and I think Sheldrake does, and I think also Lovelock saw, that there is an a priori mysterious design to the structure of universal mind.
Yeah.
If you use the term, there's a synergy of resonancies of unfathomable kind of mystery that exists within the universe, and that we move through evolution to increasing patterns of understanding of that pattern, and we may be coming to a point where we're going to come at closing quotes in a certain sense on the evolution, the development of human, the Homo sapiens, we may be coming into a new synergistically realized, growing out of an elementary just system that we find ourselves in, synergistic resonancy to universe at a level transcendent to the human experience, which would be part of the fulfilling of a purposeful universe, and that's important for people to have a sense of that as the way the universe is constructed.
It would be a new kind of order. And the night is always darkest before the dawn.
Right,
for those people who are looking around them and the world and seeing how dreadful it all is, we affirm that the night is always darkest before that dawn, but we must remember the dawn. We must anticipate the dawn. And I think what you described kind of gives the lineaments of what that new civilization will be. It will be a kind of balance and order and mystery.
And it might be an ontology of sufficiency. I use the term, because I tend to be a bit materialistically inclined in that, but that we may be, Fuller said, one of the things he said was that we are transcending scarcity. He was talking in a materialistic sense, but it was within an ontologic sense of reading the universe and so forth. We may be at a time of transcending 200,000 years of the context within which events are evolving within a larger pattern that was part of universal mind or God's pattern. But it is synergistic. It's a behavior system unpredicted by the sum of the parts. It's not absolute. It's not absolutist. It's a possibility that we could realize if...
but we have to realize how our own world views have stood in the way of that. You can have all the technological sufficiency in the world, and if we go around thinking that there are only, 20 cents, we only have 20 cents in our pocket, and we have $2 million, then we're going to resent the beggar who asks for, I should say, if we think we have $5 in our pocket and we have 100, we're going to resent the beggar who asks for a quarter or something.
Well, we're coming into a time of incredible transformation. Sorry we run into, we could talk for about 27 hours easy. It's been your pleasure to have the perception. I want to show again, at the end, if we could, perhaps they could bring it up on this camera, this book. This is the way it would look. We would highly recommend it. It's called Eternal Day, Seth Farber's book, and it's called, again, Seth, what, the subtitle?
The Christian Alternative to Secularism and Modern Psychology.
All right, and it's published by... the publisher is
Regina Orthodox Press.
Regina Orthodox Press in Massachusetts. Seth,
they have an 800 number.
Yeah, they have an 800 number if you can read it off, and we'll put off your number so they can reach you. Your pleasure to have his perceptions. We on Conversations invite you to, and we'll be coming back. Thank you very much.
1-800-636-2470.
Okay. Thank you, Seth, very much indeed. Well, we got a few thoughts in, a few patterns.